Well, thanks very much to Barry and to Tom and to the Bank of Korea for inviting me here today. I don't have an awful lot of time for the number of slides that I've prepared. Let's see, there we go. Much of what I say may come across as assertion. I wrote a paper last year, which you could refer to for background evidence of these assertions. The paper was called, Is Monetary Policy a Science? Theory and Practice Over the Last 50 Years. And it starts with a quote from Yogi Berra, the American baseball player. He said, "In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. But in practice, there is." This paper provides a certain amount of evidence for my assertions, but the fundamental point that I make in the paper, looking back over the last 50 years, much of which I'm not sure whether I'm sad to say this, I've actually lived through, because I've been in this business for 45 years. The one thing that you can say about the future is it's going to be very different from the past. We've had 50 years of almost constant change in central banking, every possible aspect of it you can think of. And I dare say that that's going to continue. And not only it's going to continue, it should continue. Because, as a sort of noted contrarian, it's my view, at least, that policies that we have followed over the course of a large number of years have played a not inconsequential part in putting us in the situation that we are in, and where we are at the moment is a place where we don't really want to be. Now, where are we? Subpar growth since the crisis began. This crisis started in 2006. There have been predictions of it's going to get better every year since. And every year since, and I say this advisedly, I'm speaking for myself now, not for the OECD, every year for the last 7 years, every reputable forecasting agency has been forced to revise down their forecasts. So the world is not unfolding as it should. We are saying the same thing for next year, both the IMF and the OECD. Things are going to get better, and let's hope they will. But I have my doubts. Like, when you think about the character of the models, okay, the models basically assume that we will regress to we will go back to equilibrium. Okay, so we're going to get the inflation that we target. We're going to go back to equilibrium or potential growth rates. Okay? The economy is like a kind of machine that sort of has a proper idling speed. And we understand that and we can control it. But what if the economy isn't a machine? What if the economy is more like a forest? You know, an ecosystem that evolves, and one that is totally path dependent, you know, like the evolutionary process. What if that's the way the system really works? In that case, there is no equilibrium. And we have a very, very different way of looking at the world. Now, where we are at the moment, as I say, the forecasts are things are going to get better. But as has already been mentioned by Mr. Furusawa, there are a lot of risks out there. And every geographical region that you look at the moment looks fragile. You know, there's something going on everywhere, in the United States, in Europe, in China, in Japan. And every one of those places is a potential source of problem. And I guess what I would suggest is that with all the hopes for macro-prudential and things of that nature, our macro policies are essentially used up. I mean, interest rates are as low as they can go. Well, maybe they can go a little bit lower. Who's to say? The fiscal side in many big countries doesn't really look as if it's totally under control. So there's a lot of concerns about there. And as I say here, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. Now, how did we get here? I think monetary policy was for a long time guided by flawed theory. And the flawed theory basically says that all of the problems that we have are problems of inadequate demand, and that monetary policy can be used to back in adequate demand, and we needn't worry too much about any side effects. Now, this policy was first started in the 1960s, and the first of the side effects, the unexpected side effects, emerged pretty quickly. It was that easy money led to inflation, as indeed Milton Friedman and Ed Phelps basically said would happen. It basically led to inflation. And then Greenspan, of course, Paul Volcker stepped in the early 1980s, and through very disciplined monetary policy managed to get inflation back down again. But that period of time of monetary discipline was really very short nature, because when Alan Greenspan came in 1987, you may remember they first started talking about the Greenspan put. And in my judgment, those kinds of policies, Greenspan put and put plus, I guess, basically characterized monetary policy in the United States and in many other countries for well over 20 years. So every time there was a hint of a downturn, what we had in 1987, in 1990, in 1997, in 1998, in 2001, and 2007, every time there was a hint of a downturn, the answer was the same. It was monetary easing. And I think what's happened here, again going back to the sort of evolutionary, got to be concerned about the stocks, where you are, depends on where you've come from, is we've had basically, leading up to 2007, a process of continuous debt accumulation of a sort that I think we've got some economic historians here, but I dare say debt accumulation of a sort and a magnitude that we've never seen before in human history, except for wartimes. So that was really the situation in 2007 when the crisis began. And, of course, we had all of these imbalances by 2007, not just the debts, but the asset prices that had gone through the roof and savings rates in many, many countries that were zero, investment ratios in China that were 50%. So that's sort of where we were in 2007. And then the question is, well, what happened since? Well, I think what happened since was more of the same. Central banks have eased as they did before 2007, but faced with the magnitude of the crisis in an even more aggressive way than they ever did before. It was originally done for purposes of financial stability, you remember, in 2007 and 2008. But since then, the purpose of monetary policy has changed dramatically. The basic exercise now is to, again, stimulate aggregate demand as opposed to temporarily dealing with problems of financial instability. And it is effectively the only game in town, essentially because fiscal, as you know, in many countries is already moving in the opposite direction. Regulatory policy is very largely uncoordinated with monetary policy. And so the upshot is that regulatory policy has basically been foot on the brake, leaving monetary policy with its foot on the accelerator. So it really has been the only game in town. The problem is that it's not really working. Now, here we are, it's 2015, and monetary policy has been this aggressive mode since 2007. And as I say, it's been a very weak growth relative to what we might typically have expected. One might say, why has it been so weak? Well, the first point I would make, I suppose, is that you need to look at economic history to see that what we're seeing today is not unusual. Like, I was the discussant of a paper by Reinhardt and Reinhardt at Jackson Hole in 2013, where they look at the long history of economic crises that are associated with financial crises. And their basic conclusion was that 10 years is not a long time. You know, these types of crises take a long time to mend themselves. And I think if you went back and looked at the history of economic thought, you'd also come to the same conclusion. People talk about the monetary policies that we're following as being Keynesian. But if you go back and you look at Keynes, what you realize is that the policies that we're following today are the policies that Keynes recommended in the treatise on money. But by the time he had written the general theory, his conclusion was that there were problems with the sole use of monetary policy. And it has, of course, got an awful lot of undesirable side effects. And there, I think, again, one has to refer back to the history of economic thought. Undesirable side effects, I'm thinking about Wicksell. Wicksell said over 100 years ago it'll end up in inflation. Hayek said it'll end up with resource misallocations and all sorts of problems. Richard Koo said you'll get balance sheet problems and balance sheet recessions. And Hyminsky said stability will breed instability. The banking system will be the focus of problems. There's all sorts of reasons to believe that there are undesirable side effects from these policies. And of course, exit is not going to be easy, and that's what this conference is all about. And it will be very interesting to hear people's views on this. One reason why exit is not going to be very easy, particularly in the United States, is essentially because of uncertainties. The modalities of getting out of this thing, exiting. Should you cut the size of the balance sheet first? Should you raise interest rates first? Is it possible to do either one or the other? There's growing concerns now that the reverse repo thing may be more complicated than people think. Uncertainty about the effects of easing. You can ease too early. You can exit too early, as people say the Fed did in 1937. You can exit too late, as people said the Fed did in the early 1950s. Both of these views, I think, are probably right. But uncertainty, the fallback position, is always just stay where you are. I think there's a lot of debtors who are gaining from current policies who are going to resist getting out of them. So more of the same, and we may have some difficulties. Well, what lessons do we draw from all of this about the future of central banking? I want to suggest that there's 4 sets of lessons. One of them has to do with methodological issues, both our analytic and other frameworks that we use to set monetary policy. I think we need to think, too, about how we actually implement policy. And I think one of the central points, and I'll come back to this at the end, is that we must be more humble about what it is that we're trying to achieve, that perhaps we're trying to do more than our knowledge allows us to do. I want to say a few words about central banks and short-term crisis management, then medium-term crisis resolution, and then lastly, longer-term crisis prevention. It's very important to distinguish between these different modes. Crisis management, getting out of, you're in the crisis, how do you reduce the short-term costs? Crisis resolution, we're in a mess, how do we get out of the mess? And then the third thing, crisis prevention and institutional frameworks. The methodological issues, changes that we need to make as we go forward. I think it's fair to say that the analytical models that we use, both the complicated ones, DSGE type, big structural models, and even the the judgmental frameworks that central bank governors have got in their heads, which may be either more simple or more complicated than the analytical models, they gave us virtually no advance warning at all about what was going on. And it seems to me that if that's the case, we ought to go back and start thinking more fundamentally about the models that we use. Not least of which is the fundamental analytical framework, whether the equilibrium framework has served us well or whether it hasn't. We need to go back and think about this stuff. I think in terms of the methodological issues, we need to pay much more attention to economic history, to the history of economic thought. These things have almost disappeared from the curricula of universities. They ought not to have done. We should be thinking more about the historical experiences and what people have learned from history. This reference here from the classics to complexity via Hayek. There's a lot of modeling going on now in terms of complex dynamic systems, these so-called ACE models. agent-based, computationally based economics. Again, I think there's a lot of promise in it, a lot of very, very simple insights that come from thinking about the economy as a complex system, not least of which is that in these complex adaptive systems, crises happen all the time. The lesson is pretty simple. Be prepared. And we were totally unprepared in 2007 and in Europe in 2010. I'd make the point that price stability and financial stability are good things, but they're not sufficient to secure macroeconomic stability. Balance sheets, corporate balance sheets, household balance sheets are every bit as important, and we need to pay attention to those things. Credit and debt needs much more attention. I think it's fair to say, and this brings us back to Keynes and Frank Knight in the 1920s, maybe the world is not characterized by risk, which is to say a world in which you can calculate probability distributions. Maybe it's much more characterized by uncertainty, where where we just simply have no idea of what the outcomes might be. Again, back to my call for humility. And why, lastly, if I say that I think we need to rethink a lot of this stuff, I would say I don't think, from my personal perspective, that we're seeing enough of a willingness to say we've got to rethink in a fundamental way. So, methodological issues. Think again. Near-term crisis management. As I said a moment ago, crises are inevitable in complex systems. We were not prepared for them. We should have been. Ex-ante preparations for crises. A lot of people say, oh, don't do that. There'll be more moral hazard involved. But if you don't prepare for a crisis in advance, what you will do in the middle of the crisis is probably the least effective and most costly policy that you could possibly follow. So being prepared is very important. Ex post, central banks have got a huge role to play. I worry very much about what's going on in the United States, Dodd-Frank, and attempts to sort of prevent the Fed and, for that matter, by analogy, others, from doing the things that need to be done in the middle of a crisis. That's the point when central banks, with a real understanding of how financial markets work, can do what needs to be done. And they have to be able to respond flexibly and unconventionally, because in these complex adaptive systems, what's the phrase? History never repeats itself, but it rhymes. Every crisis is a bit different from the previous one, and so you need the insights of how the markets work to figure out what to do. Medium-term crisis resolution. Everybody in this room knows that the crisis is not over, in the sense that we all believe that we can go to bed at night and we'll wake up in the morning and we will be returned to normalcy. This is not the case. The crisis is not yet over. Now then, is still more of the same the answer? I guess what I'm going to suggest, and I hope this is not heresy, is that a problem of crisis resolution where the underlying problem is too much debt. This is an insolvency crisis. It is not an illiquidity crisis. And an insolvency crisis can only be dealt with by governments, and in particular by the capacity to look directly into the eyes of the debt problem and resolve it. This is not a problem for central banks. Central banks may provide an element of complementary policy, but fundamentally, this is a job for governments. What should they do? Use any available room for maneuver on the fiscal front. Encourage public and private investment. I've already mentioned explicit debt reduction, bank recapitalization, structural reforms. All of these things are required. But just simply relying on central banks to print the money is not the right answer. And I was suggesting to Tom Sargent here just a moment ago, who wrote a very famous paper many years ago with Neil Wallace, which is called Some Unpleasant Monetarist Arithmetic, having to do with the interaction of big fiscal deficits, big fiscal debts, rational or semi-rational expectations, and very expansionary monetary policy. This is a paper that you should go back and read again. I'll skip this. Could the effectiveness of monetary stimulus be improved if the governments don't do the things that they should do? The answer is probably yes. but it's by no means certain. And the problems, as already been mentioned, the question of how do you protect yourself depends on whether you're an advanced market economy or whether you are obviously, and has already been mentioned, in the more exposed position of an emerging market economy that has been subject to big capital inflows and could yet be subject to big capital outflows. Longer-term crisis prevention. Well, how best to conduct monetary policy when we're back to normal again? That's really what we're talking about. And I remind you, we're, I think, a long way from normal. But when you're back to normal, how do you prevent what has happened from happening again? One possibility is a higher inflation target. We've heard people talk about that. My worry would be that if you were to do that, why not just do it even more? If you can ratchet up your inflation target from 2 to 4, why not 4 to 6, 6 to 8? That's a worrisome possibility. And one also inquires, if you were to do that, how many more imbalances would you have to generate in the credit and debt system in order to get the inflation rate up to that higher level? So I think there's some serious thinking that needs to be done about that. More use of unconventional monetary policy instruments. Again, the jury's still out on whether all of this stuff that we've done recently works, whether the side effects are greater than the benefits that they provide. I think the jury's still out. One thing I think we can say looking forward is we need a lot more emphasis on supply-side shocks and in global developments. The supply-side shocks, we spent 15 or 20 years in the advanced market economies trying to prevent inflation from going down below the level that we wanted. But the economy at the time was subject to massive disinflationary pressure coming out from the return of China and of the Eastern European countries back into the global trading system. Then in a certain sense, it was a good deflation that we were leading against. And in the process, I think, created some of the problems that we do have. So I think looking forward, when we're back to normal, there's more to the economy than the demand side. There's the supply side. We've got to keep that in mind. And of course, there's more to the economy than just short-term stuff. We also have to keep thinking much more about the longer-term implications. Should monetary policy lean against the wind of excessive credit? Mr. Furusawa has just noted that the fund is doing a lot of thinking about this. I know the OECD is as well, and they should be, because there's some very complicated issues here. But it's a big topic for research. One thing I think that we can say is that we need a longer policy horizon. We need more symmetry over the cycle, a greater willingness to tighten, as great a willingness to tighten as a willingness to ease. And I think we need a greater tolerance for downturns, too. Little downturns don't do a great deal of harm, creative destruction. What we really want to avoid is the buildup of stock imbalances that will essentially lead to a really big crisis. Other policies could help. I just note that. We may talk about that later on in the day. Let me just finish with a word about governance, which Mr. Furusawa has also mentioned. It is essential that the capacity of central banks and others to operate independently from short-term political pressures be maintained. Having said that, we are clearly moving out of the world in which central banks could say, I'm only interested in price stability, finished, and that can be monitored and I can be held accountable. We are in a world where central banks have already been drawn into financial stability issues, and quite so. I mean, central banks were set up in the first place to deal with financial stability issues, and they're being drawn back in. So the world is, and it always has been, more complicated than just simply control price stability. That means that central banks will have to work more closely with other arms of government. That is inevitable. But what is very important is that capacity to deal independently of short-term political pressure be maintained. And finally, I conclude by saying resolving the crisis should be our first priority. Governments have got a big role to play in this. I think they have overburdened the central banks, and that, I think, is unfortunate. We are in the process of reviewing a lot of pre-crisis beliefs. I think we should be doing that with even more vigor than is currently apparent. There is, in fact, a lot to debate. There is no consensus in many of these very, very important issues, and that's why a conference today could be so useful. And I finish, this is a bugbear, I don't know, of Barry's and certainly of mine. I think underneath it all, what's happened has been the absence of an international monetary system which has certain rules that would constrain people from going as far as they have in doing what they have done. I think we really need to go back and rethink about the international monetary system. We have a none system as it currently stands, from which I think the emerging markets are perhaps seeing the worst effects. So these are all of the things that I think we need to do. I think today's conference is going to be a good step on doing it. But nevertheless, I wish you good luck, because I think you might still just need it.
Thank you, Chairman, for your visionary remarks.